This video was made possible with the support of our Patreon members. Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to Psychology Is. I am your host, Nick Fortino, and I'm so excited to introduce you to Dr. Nicholas Christakis today. Welcome. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Christakis.
Thank you for having me, Nick, and call me Nicholas.
Deal. Many of you may know about Nicholas already. He's an incredibly distinguished, prolific scholar. Dr. Christakis he holds the title of Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University and is director of the Human Nature Lab at Yale University. And if you don't know what the title Sterling Professor means, it's the highest rank you can possibly achieve at Yale University. So here what we have is, one of the most high-ranking professors and researchers at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And it's just such an honor to have you. I know I mentioned to you that I teach psychology at a community college, and I teach social psychology specifically. And my students and I love learning about your work on social networks and on, especially what the content of this book here. One of your 4 main books is called Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. So along with writing these 4 books, which also include Death Foretold, Connected, the surprising power of our social networks and how they shape our lives, Blueprint, the one I just mentioned, as well as your most recent one, Apollo's Arrow, the profound and enduring impact of the coronavirus on the way we live. Along with that, you've just written hundreds of articles and book chapters. Like I said, incredibly distinguished, prolific scholar, professor, researcher. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I have many questions, written down ahead of time, but I also trust that the conversation here will flow organically and that I'll have questions arise spontaneously as well. So sort of a semi-structured approach here. But let's dive right in. So my first question to you is, you have 2 doctorates, an incredibly rare feat. And so I'm curious to know, you went to medical school and earned your medical degree from Harvard, graduated in 1989, and then in 1991 began a PhD program in sociology at Yale University. So at Penn, pardon me, thank you. So I'm curious to know, what motivated you? Why did you feel that was necessary? Upon completing your medical degree, what prompted you to study sociology after that?
Well, there's a lot of serendipity in every step there. First of all, what's really the question is, why did I go to medical school? And the reason has to do with the fact that, my mother was terminally ill when I was a boy, and all of my mother's sons became doctors. So
Right.
I think that there's not a coincidence there. I grew up with a wonderful mother who loved us deeply and died young. She was 47 when she died. I was 25 when she ultimately died, but she was diagnosed when I was 6. So I grew up with a kind of sword of Damocles over my head, always wondering whether my mother would live or die. Desperate to know more medicine, desperate, I suppose, psychologically to do something to be helpful. And as were my brothers. One of my sisters became a lawyer, so we always tease her and joke about that. But so I went to medical school, but I also grew up in a very scientific family, and we had a lot of interest in science and scientific research. My mother originally trained in physical chemistry, and my father was a nuclear physicist. So, we were very scientifically minded immigrants. My parents immigrated to the United States. And so I kind of wanted a career in science, but and in college, I had sort of also been interested in the social sciences, but was a bit too timid to pursue the social sciences. I thought it was safer to study biology. I actually wanted to study semiotics in college. And so So I get a degree in at Yale in biology. This was in 1984. I finally graduated. I took a year off while I was in school for various reasons, and um, and then I get into Harvard Medical School. And it's one of those things, when you get into Harvard Medical School, nobody asks you, "Are you really sure you want to do this?" You get quite the opposite reaction, which is affirmation. And honestly, I think it could even be a valuable heuristic in life. When everyone is telling you what you're doing is terrific, maybe that's when you should stop and think, why am I doing this thing? Uh, and uh, and so I had like my head down like the sheep following up the butt of the sheep in front of me, just sort of. And I go to Harvard Medical School, and it's during that period that my mother finally gets very sick and dies, and I knew that I couldn't. I grew up in Washington, D.C. She was in Washington. I knew I couldn't be helpful to her in her last year of life. And by then I had become very interested, of course, in the care of the dying in our society. We do a terrible job caring for the dying in our societies. Still today, something like half or more than half of Americans die in pain. We're the richest society in the world and have one of the most advanced medical systems, and yet we don't do well simply relieving patients of pain near the end of their life. It's ridiculous. It's actually immoral and offensive. Anyway, so I wanted to be there to help her. So I took a year off in medical school to get a master's in public health degree, which would give me more control over my schedule. And it was during that time that my interest in the social sciences was rekindled. And in addition to that, I realized that medical training alone was no longer adequate at the end of the 20th century to have a career as a scientist. So the heyday of scientific doctors was in the 50s, when a medical degree was adequate to be a first-rate scientist. You really needed a PhD training, I came to realize. And so here I was. My mother finally died actually early in the year, unexpectedly in September. I had this year of between my second and third years of medical school where I was immersed at the Harvard School of Public Health, which is a fantastic institution, very intellectual, very cosmopolitan, very interesting place to be as a young person, taking classes that were tinged in social science, epidemiology, health behavior classes, statistics, health policy classes. And so I found myself interested again in the social sciences. And then I had the serendipity of reading a very famous essay in a medical history class I was taking with a well-known medical historian named Alan Brandt. He taught us an essay called Training for Detached Concern by a very famous sociologist of medicine who would eventually become one of my mentors, Renee Fox. This was an essay that she wrote in the 50s about how doctors are trained to be concerned for their patients, to be moved by them and their predicament, but not consumed by that, because you don't want a doctor that's overly emotionally connected. You don't want an automaton and a sociopath as a doctor, but you also don't want a doctor that's unable to function because they're so emotionally involved in what's happening to their patients. And so she wrote this very famous essay, and I read it. This would have been in 1989. I read it, and she had written it in mid 1950s, so 30 years earlier. And I was like, oh my God, everything's the same still. I was sort of reminded of the fact that qualitative social scientists can perceive fundamental truths about the world. And here's an enduring truth about how doctors were trained that hadn't changed. And incidentally, still hasn't changed another 30 years later. And Training for Detached Concern. And Sheldon wrote a companion essay called Training for Uncertainty. We read both of them. And so it was during this period that I kind of reformulated my desire to get a PhD in something. And I was sort of thinking, okay, it'll be in the social sciences. And for various reasons, mostly serendipity, that I met Renee, I decided to do it in sociology, which is not a super high status PhD. I could have picked. I also at the time was being mentored by a very famous anthropologist by the name of Arthur Kleinman, who's still a friend and advisor. And I could have done economics, I could have done psychology, but I wound up picking sociology. And Renee was at the time a professor at Penn, and that's how I chose to go to Penn to get my PhD, which was essential, as I've been saying, to getting research training, to be trained in methods, in statistics, in theory, and that was my PhD, which I got after I did my residency. So I went to Penn and I spent 6 years at Penn, did my medical residency and my fellowship and my PhD. And in 1995, at the age of 33, finally finished my formal education and went to the University of Chicago as an assistant professor to begin my academic career.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and so much of your work really appears to be the outcome of a synthesis of the expertise in these two fields. You know, your footing in biology and medical practice, and your understanding of the broader social dynamics, the social science of it all. So, and I think Blueprint is like it's just a prime example of the synthesis of those expertise. So I'd love to dive in to, you know, the insight in this book. And I also want to make sure we talk a lot about social networks and the impact that they have on our social lives and how they form. So in
Yeah, I should
diving
say
in,
that one of the ironies is that social network science or network analysis is one of this, in my judgment, signal contributions of sociology in the last century. And the irony is that if I hadn't done sociology, it's not clear to me I would have been exposed to networks. So what
now,
happened is during my sociology training at Penn, there were classes we learned about networks and mapping networks and network analysis and some of the history of study of networks that goes back 100 years in sociology with periodic peaks in the 50s and the 70s and so on. So so I had this exposure to this idea, and this was, in retrospect, enormously valuable and life changing, actually, because come the late 1990s, when I'm practicing as a hospice doctor in Chicago, and studying the widower effect, and which is the increased probability of the recently bereaved to die. At some point, I have the recognition that this widower effect, which is, my risk of death goes up when my wife dies, is actually a simple case of a broader network phenomenon, that people are embedded in these social networks. And around this time, other scientists, primarily physicists, have been resurrecting network science. And there's a lot of ferment, but I was sort of poised to capitalize on that, or to join that movement because I had had some exposure to networks, because I had picked sociology instead of, let's say, although anthropology, psychology, and economics all also, and political science all also had a smaller tradition of network science back then. Sociology really had a still small but bigger than those others. So
yeah,
I had this exposure, and it sort of, chance favoring a prepared mind. You know, it I suddenly was able to start making these connections in the late 1990s and decide that, that's what I wanted to devote my life to, basically. So I have been studying all aspects of social networks since then: the biology, physiology, and genetics of human social networks, the mathematical architecture and psychological underpinnings of networks, ways to ways to exploit an understanding of network structure and function to intervene in public health or development economics interventions, and on and on and on. So honestly, all I've done in the last 30 years is study networks. Every damn thing you can think about networks, I've tried to think about it.
well, I'm glad that the nodes of us on the network have connected here, and that all of your work has kind of been channeled through the broader social network of which we're both part to reach me, because I find the work to be fascinating. And I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, people often ask the question, like, what is the difference between psychology and sociology? And although they're ultimately inseparable, it's ultimately, my understanding is, it's the unit of analysis, the level of zoomed in or zoomed outness by which we investigate
Yeah,
humans and their behavior.
social psychology obviously overlaps tremendously.
Yeah,
There are
right.
different norms, there are different saints in the churches. There are
Mhm, mhm.
different methods,
Right.
but in social psychology compared to, sociology. But yes, fundamentally, as a sociologist, I'm interested in collectivities. I'm interested
Mhm.
in how groups of people come to behave, and fundamentally, I'm interested in sociology in this very deep idea in sciences in general. This idea applies in physics and chemistry and psychology and in neuroscience and in sociology of what's known as emergence. And emergence is the notion that collectivities can have properties not that do not reside within the individual components, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so the simplest example of this is the metaphor of carbon. You can take carbon atoms and assemble them one way, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or you take the same carbon atoms and assemble them another way, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms. They are properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Connect the same carbon atoms a different way, you get a completely different set of properties.
Mm.
And it's the same with human groups. You can take a group of people and connect them one way, and they have one set of properties. They're cooperative and innovative and healthy and kind. Or you take the same people and connect them a different way, and they're uncooperative and uninnovative and unhealthy and unkind.
Can you describe the ways that we would connect people that would result in each of those possible outcomes?
I can give you some examples. In fact, we've done a lot of research on this, but the point is this notion of emergence is a very deep. And so for example, life is an emergent property of matter, right? You take carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen and sulfur and phosphorus and a little iron and so on, and you combine them in just the right way and you get life, right? That's a weird emergent property. Or consciousness is an emergent property of neurons. You take neurons and you connect them, you could take 200 neurons and connect them one way, you get C. elegans. Keep adding neurons and connect them another way, and eventually you get conscious humans. I mean, it's astonishing. So and in some ways you connect human beings with their own individual psychologies, and you connect them in particular ways, and you get societies which have these in their own properties. And then, of course, this is a classic Durkheimian and also Weberian perspective, or Marxist too also. I mean, Marx talks about how collectivities of people have, the bourgeoisie has its own consciousness, for example.
Yeah.
That's a notion of it. That's also an idea that's about emergence. So,
Right.
so these are old ideas and interesting and deep ideas. Some of the experiments we've done, just to put a fine point on it. So this is hard to explain. We've done many experiments. Let me quickly tell you about two of them. So in one experiment, we took thousands of people, assembled into dozens of groups, each of which had, 20 people, let's say, per group. And we dropped the people into this network structure. And then we experimentally manipulate the rules of connection in that structure. And for example, if we allow the people a little, and then we have the people play what's called a public goods game with their immediate network neighbors. So we drop you into a network, we introduce you to the 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 other people who are your new neighbors. Those people in turn have their own neighbors. You are one of them, but they have other neighbors who are not your neighbors, and so on. And we give you a little bit of money, and we say, if you contribute some of your money to your neighbors, we'll double it and divide it among your neighbors. And so you face a dilemma. You want everyone to contribute maximally. If everyone contributes maximally, everyone's doubling their wealth every round. But from a selfish point of view, what you should do is give nothing, hope that everyone else contributes. Of course, if everyone does that and does what's known as defect, then the society collapses and you don't get any cooperation, and everyone's miserable. It's a little bit like a public good. Another example is a lighthouse. So, you don't want to pay taxes to have a lighthouse built. It's clearly to everyone's advantage to have a lighthouse in a seafaring country. So the lighthouse is a public good. You can't, once it's built, you can't prevent other people from using the light. It's not like a piece of cake, right? This is my cake and no one else can have it. You can't say it's my lighthouse, no one else can use it. Anyone can use it. So we need to tax people, basically. We need a government to tax people to get the funds to build a lighthouse. Otherwise, everyone would say, well, let other people build a lighthouse. I'll still get to use it. So that's a classic public good. Anyway, so we have people play this public goods game. We drop them into these networks, and it's a little bit like those high school science projects some listeners may remember, where your teacher said, okay, you 4 kids, Betty, Susie, and Jane, and you are going to work on your science project, or Tom, Dick, and Harry, and you are going to work on your science project, and you're all going to get the same grade. So you're going to work together, you're a team, you're going to do this science project, and then you all get the same grade. And now you're assigned to 3 losers, and they don't do any work. And you have 2 unpleasant options. Either you can do all the work, and so because you want an A, and they get credit for doing nothing, or you can say, well, they're not going to do anything, I'm not going to do anything either, and you all get an F. So both options are terrible. But that's your predicament in that type of a situation. And so what you find in those types of situations of fixed groups, a network where no social fluidity is allowed, is that cooperation disappears. Everyone stops cooperating. And in that type of a society, you get like a complete defunct society, like everyone becomes a defector and mean-spirited by the end. So we did this experiment where we dropped people into this society with that type of topological rules, where you have fixed connections, and now you're supposed to contribute to your neighbors. Maybe you start by being nice, and then your neighbors take advantage of you, and then you're like, well, to hell with that. Then you start defecting, and then defection spreads through the system, and everyone's defecting by the end. In a different branch of the experiment, however, we had different rules of connection, where we allowed each person at every time step not only to decide whether to cooperate or defect, but also with a low degree of probability to cut some ties. For example, to cut ties to these mean defectors. And we found that that rule converted people from mean-spirited sons of bitches to really sweet, nice people.
Good.
So this is an example of an experiment where it's not the people themselves that determine whether the whole group is cooperative or not. It's the structural rules of their social interactions that guides that. I discussed that experiment in Blueprint and other similar experiments, but that's one experiment and one idea. And by the way, let me just illustrate. That particular experiment has to do with the social fluidity, the extent to which rewiring is possible. But there are by coincidence, many social institutions in our society which would seem to have evolved to perform this function. So, for example, consider the institution of marriage. If you lived in a society where divorce was impossible, so no rewiring, once you have your spouse, you're stuck with that spouse forever. In a situation in which your spouse is abusive and mean to you, then your alternative is to be nice and tolerant of this abusive spouse for your whole life and be a patsy, or to also become abusive and mean and exploitative. So then you have a horrible marriage anyway, just like the science experiment from high school I alluded to. So that's clearly terrible. At the other extreme, you could imagine, and so you don't make any investments in the marriage in that type of situation. At the other extreme, you can imagine a society in which divorce is trivially easy. You just say to someone, I divorce you, and they're divorced. In that type, and you have like a new spouse every day. It's total social fluidity. Well, in that type of society, you would also not make investments in a marriage. So you want a set of rules about divorce and marriage that provide for some stickiness where you can't easily get out of the marriage, but not impossible.
Yeah.
And that type of a regime might in fact be the regime which optimizes the investments that partners are willing to make in each other. So these experiments that we do also can shed some light on broader social institutions, not just the network topological question that we explore. Anyway, that's one example. We have other experiments we do with network structure too.
Very interesting. And yeah, great example with the institution of marriage. So I'm gathering that in your assessment, the way we have instituted marriage in our society in the US achieves this kind of fine line between
middle range.
Yeah.
But there are other examples. Like if you look at housing policy, so if you think of disorder as an emergent property of social systems, and you're asking yourself about the role of network structure in disorder, imagine an environment like in Soviet Russia where everyone is assigned their house, assigned an apartment, and you can never leave it. And so are your neighbors. And your neighbors are really sloppy. They start throwing garbage in the hallway. They put graffiti in the hallway. You have no incentive to go and clean up the graffiti. And even to be clean yourself. I mean, why would you be, taking good care of your garbage when everyone else is throwing their garbage in the hallway? So eventually you become slovenly too. You start throwing your garbage in the hallway. That's what everyone is doing. Conversely, imagine the other extreme where we have, so in that type of a housing policy, everyone is tied to an address permanently. At the other extreme, imagine a very transient population where every day you have new neighbors. People are constantly moving through the neighborhood, constantly changing. Here too, you have no incentive to invest in your neighborhood. Your neighbors, start making a mess. Well, they're going to be different neighbors tomorrow. Why should you shovel the walkway in front of your house and your neighbor's house when that neighbor is not going to be the same guy tomorrow? It's going to be a different guy. There's no reason for you to be nice to this person. So you want is a housing policy that incentivizes you to stay put, but doesn't prohibit you from ever leaving. like the home mortgage deduction, for example, the kind of institutions we have that try to create some stability in our residential lives, but not
Right.
permanent. And
Right.
so once again, we have a whole host of laws and norms and policies in our society about neighborhood stability that try to put us in that middle range of topological fluidity.
Mm, makes perfect sense. And so, do I understand correctly that, maybe I would say the thesis of Blueprint is that we each carry within us an evolutionary blueprint for making a good society? And so is it your assessment that we have it because our species has evolved, certain, as you call it, the social suite, the characteristics, the features that contribute to a good society, that those features, which we'll talk about in just a second and I can read off, are embedded in our genetics essentially, or
Yeah.
we have, and that translates to arranging ourselves in ways that produce thriving societies.
Yes, in part, that's correct. So the argument is that just like natural selection has shaped the structure and function of our bodies, and natural selection has shaped the structure and function of our minds through evolutionary psychology, for example, natural selection has also shaped the structure and function of our societies, of our groups. We live the way we do socially in part because of the fitness landscape, the Darwinian pressures we faced in the past. And in the book, I talk a little bit about some of these traits. For example, love, the fact that we have a sentimental attachment to the people with whom we have sex. Um, that's an evolved phenotype, and we're not the only animals that have a sentimental attachment to their other mates. Um, but we do, and it is shaped by natural selection. Or friendship. Friendship is really interesting. I mean, technically, friendship is the volitional, long-term, non-reproductive union with an unrelated conspecific.
Next.
Namely, you have a friend. And the
Mhm.
key there is that person is not your kin. You're not genetically related to this person. Everyone listening to this knows what it's like to have friends. But that's a really weird phenotype, the fact that we have friends. It's not common in the animal kingdom. We do it. Certain other primates do it. Both living elephant species do it, Asian and African elephants, and certain cetacean species like orcas, for example, and bottlenose dolphins do it. So they form long-term non-reproductive unions with unrelated conspecifics. And we evolved this capacity, of course, independently of elephants and dolphins. Our last common ancestor with elephants was 90 million years ago. And yet they, as we, have evolved this capacity for friendship. And incidentally, as a result, the emergent networks that arise, each person is picking their friends, each entity, each elephant is picking their friends, each human is. And we assemble ourselves into these beautiful, ornate networks that we then live out our lives within, just like the elephants do. And they independently evolve this same exact. And by the way, our networks are this very similar mathematically to elephant networks, which is also a very interesting observation. So this is an evolved interpersonal social phenotype that is one of the, as you said, things I call the social suite. So the social suite is a set of traits that we evolved to manifest that are partially genetically encoded. They're also shaped by culture, of course, and that require the presence of others to express. So, for example, things like religion, I don't put because the religion is the workings of your mind, and you can have religious sentiments and beliefs on your own. You can be by yourself and have these beliefs. But things like love, we're not talking about whether you love yourself or are kind to yourself, or befriend yourself or cooperate. You can't cooperate with yourself. Other members of your species are required for you to manifest those traits. And that's the category of things that I'm interested in. Things that
Yeah.
we manifest interpersonally and that are partially genetically encoded, not solely due to culture.
And I know you just mentioned a few, but I'll read them off just to explicate it for the listeners. So at the core of all societies, you say, I will show, is the social suite. 1, the capacity to have and recognize individual identity. 2, the love for partners and offspring. 3, friendship. Also social networks. Cooperation. Preference for one's own group, that is in-group bias. mild hierarchy, so relative egalitarianism, and social learning and teaching. And so if we, the thought experiment of if you were to somehow, if it were possible to send a bunch of babies to another planet, if we could run this experiment, is it your thesis that those babies would most likely evolve, assuming, barring extreme external forces, they would evolve to form societies and manifest these traits?
Yes, that's the argument, that if you could do that experiment, which people have thought of doing, and it's been called the forbidden experiment, to take a group of babies and somehow magically contrive to have them raised aculturally
Mm,
and feed them and raise them to adulthood. Their bodies, you probably most listeners can imagine that their pancreas would work the same.
right,
You raise a baby in an environment which there's normal food. If you raise a baby in starvation, their pancreas, of course, in adulthood
right,
would be different. But if you raise the baby in a convivial environment, its pancreas will secrete insulin and work like any other human pancreas. It can't help but do that. It's genetically prescribed that that's how the pancreas will work.
right.
Again, absent mutations or pancreatic diseases that are genetic in origin and so on. So the same, I argue, would go for our social lives, that we would have friends, that these babies abandoned on this island, when they grow up, they would befriend each other. This would be an unavoidable social manifestation that they would have to manifest,
Mm,
social property that they would have to manifest. So, but it's entertaining to think about this experiment, and analogs of this experiment have been thought of by various rulers for thousands of years. So Herodotus writes about Psamtik the Fourth, I think it was, that wanted to know what language humans would speak if they weren't taught it. What's the innate language? Anticipating Noam Chomsky, by
mhm.
thousands of years,
Yeah.
and and he and other rulers, like for example, I think King James the something of Scotland, like 500 years ago, wanted to know. These were often framed theologically. These questions, like what was the language of Adam and Eve? So
Mm,
what they thought to themselves was, well, why don't we take some babies and have them be raised by a mute shepherd up in the mountains, and then come back 15 years later and see what language the babies were speaking. And allegedly these experiments were attempted.
mm,
Allegedly, in the Scottish experiment, the babies allegedly spoke passable Hebrew, was what
mm,
they concluded that the babies came to speak, in keeping with their theological expectations.
mhm.
Uh, but obviously, we can't do such an experiment. I mean, it would be unethical and impossible. So we look for proxies, and in my book, in my laboratory, we do experiments where we take groups of people and who are strangers to each other. We thrust them together in these online laboratories, and in this godlike way, we experimentally manipulate their interactions, like dropping them into a lattice that looks like carbon, that looks like diamond versus graphite, for example. It's not actually the structure, but
Right.
just to return to that metaphor, and then we see how they behave in these different structures, for example. Or in one part of the book, I look at a kind of a poor proxy for this, which is the natural experiment of shipwrecks. So I look at all 7,000 shipwrecks that occurred during the period of the European exploration of the world between 1500 and 1900, and I find 20 shipwrecks where at least 19 people were ashore for at least 2 months and tried to reconstitute some kind of social order. And I look at all the evidence that we have, the testament, the records, the stories that the survivors wrote about what happened, and the archaeological excavations, and try to see what kind of society did these groups of people make. And anyway, that's another example, the
Yeah.
kind of data that I try to bring to bear to argue about what kind of social order is natural to us.
Which I found fascinating. And then also the example of the intention, those are like the unintentional
Yeah.
communities. And then you talked about the intentional communities. So this leads me to my next maybe two-part question. The first part is, what external forces would undermine the manifestation of these
Well, I
traits?
mean, like we alluded to earlier, we have a body plan that our genes forecast, absent
Mhm.
a mutation that makes you be born, for example, with a cleft lip and palate or some kind of injury. It's not cleft lip and palate, I don't think, is a genetic disorder. It has to do with some kind of errors in the development of your face when the face is developing and the two halves of the face are fusing and so on
Mm.
early in embryogenesis. But there are obviously genetic disorders. There are obviously intrauterine developmental disorders. But absent those, our body plans are specified. How your eyes work, how your ears work, how your pancreas works, how your kidney works. All of those things are specified by your genes.
Yep.
And 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 so, but if I starve you in utero, or I starve you when you're a child, you might have been predestined to have a certain height genetically. You might have predestined to be 6'2", but now I starve you, like in a famine, and you only grow up to be 5'10". Let's say you lose 4 inches in height, and you have a greater risk of diabetes because you were starved as a child, and so your pancreas adapted to a different early environment.
Mm.
Just like that, there can be insults to the natural social order. So, for example, resource poor environments can lead to dysfunctional societies. If you're actually trying to form a group of people that's well functioning, but in an incredible scarcity, you may not see these natural manifestations.
Mm.
Or extremely violent environment. Like if you grow up in a country that's been at war for centuries, and you're being bombed. Or one example I talk about in the book is totalitarian regimes. For example, the Stasi in East Germany tried to subvert our natural tendency to friendship by making everyone suspicious of everyone else. Something like 50% of East Germans were Stasi informants. So you didn't know who to trust. You couldn't. One of the chief functions of friendship was to provide information and solace to your friends and get it, and likewise get it from them. You couldn't do that in Stasi Germany. You didn't know for sure that this person wasn't informing on you. And so that's a very subversive thing, but it requires a totalitarian regime to stop people from being friendly. And it requires extreme violence to stop people
Right.
from forming these kinds of cooperative collectivities that we are wont to form.
Mm.
So yes, in answer to your question, there are exogenous forces which could interrupt the natural manifestations of social order, just like there are exogenous forces that could interrupt the natural manifestations of our body function.
Mm. What about when you talk about many examples in the book of people who attempt to create utopian micro societies, communities, and that in many of those examples, in fact, maybe all of them, it ends up going awry. Things don't manifest as a utopia in the way that they were
Yeah.
trying to make it manifest like that. What tends to go wrong if we have the genetic blueprint for thriving societies and we have what often begin as good intentions to
Yeah,
create?
but those intentions
Yeah.
cannot be at variance with our natural predilections.
Mm.
So a lot of those intentional communities, like the Shakers, for example, uh, didn't want sex. That's
Right.
not natural, and
Right.
that's not a utopian society that can survive for multiple
Mm.
obvious reasons. First of all, it can't reproduce itself because they're not having sex.
Right.
But second, people want to have sex. They want to be in
Right.
love, and you cannot really suppress that. Incidentally, the problem of attachment to our mates has been a thoroughgoing problem for intentional communities for thousands of years. We have records of people going back thousands of years, like back to Roman times, when people would say, society's screwed up. Let's go out and make a utopian society of our own. And a little band of hardy travelers goes to try to reestablish society anew, often on different principles. If those principles are in keeping with the social suite, that society can survive. But if it's against the social suite, it cannot. And often these types of groups, which are often led by charismatic leaders, really want the members of the group to have a fealty to the leader or to the group. And therefore, for them, the family unit is a threat. So to the extent that you love your partner and your children instead of dear leader, that's a problem for group
Yeah.
solidarity in their ideology. And so the solutions to this have been either extreme. Either love no one, in other words, no sex, like the Shakers, or a kind of runaway polyamory, like you can have sex with anyone. So, like these free sex communities. Ironically, both of those extremes are solutions to the same problem, which is we don't want you to have a special affection for your
Mhm.
own partner and your own children. We want you to have this sort of utopian commitment to everybody. And that
Right.
invariably breaks down. Both of
Yeah.
those extremes do not survive more than one or two generations uh, in as far as I can tell, all of recorded history. Now, there are certain examples that do better than others. I talk about them in the book, but that's a general rule.
Mm. Makes perfect sense. One reflection I'll share that I'd love to hear you respond to is, I think at this in this day and age, in this moment in time, many people are, diagnosed with one mental disorder or another, and are often interpret that as, essentially something's wrong with me. And, while sometimes the root of a person's dysfunction might be individual, like something about their particular biology or something like that, I think we underemphasize the possibility that it's more general to the network or to the way in which we've structured our society, in that it, whether it's the microcosm of like the household or the community or the society at large, that there's something that is inconsistent with our natural predilections, and that is manifesting as some type of dysfunction or anguish or suffering of some kind. But I think it perhaps a relief for a person. Like in social psychology, we talk about internal attributions versus external attributions. What do you attribute to the cause of someone's condition to be? And often I think many people make internal attributions for their own dysfunction. They blame it on themselves, essentially. They think it's rooted within themselves, and they underestimate the degree to which there may be consequences essentially rippling through a social network, or ways in which we've structured our local or broader societies that go against the natural predilections and cause this. Um, so I guess I would just love to hear you respond to this, reflect on this idea of, when a person is dysfunctional, when they're suffering, when they're depressed, when they're anxious, to what degree can we attribute this to a broader social network or to the broader structure of society?
Well, this is obviously a very complex question, and unfortunately, even in 2025, we don't understand the brain and mental illness anywhere nearly as good as even I thought we would, 30 years ago. Uh, and there are many. I don't have. I mean, there are many things I could say, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. Like, part of the problem is that it's hard to tell where the variation in mental experience of human beings feathers off into disease, into disorder. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
clearly the case that brains can be diseased. If they couldn't be diseased, why would, of all the organs in the body, why would just the brain be immune to
Right.
disease? I mean, obviously, brains can become diseased.
Mm-hmm.
They can have brain tumors. They can have dementia. They can have mental illness, just like we have physical illness. And the thing about the brain is, like, when your pancreas is dysfunctional, you get diabetes. When your brain is dysfunctional, you get anxiety, depression, and social uh, disruption, because our brains are, among other things, are social organs. They're sensing organs, but they're the organ we use to interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's clear that brains can have disease, and it's clear that is a biological and individual phenomenon. My brain is diseased. It's my brain. It's not all of our brains. But as to the causes of that, of course, that's multifactorial. Some of it's genetic, some of it's environmental, some of it's stochastic. It's just chance, like any other condition. Viral, pathogens. I mean, like the usual. I think that for diseases of other body organs in general, like, we only can explain the cause like 50% of the time. 50%, we have no idea why your pancreas failed. The other time is, well, there's some toxins, or there's a pathogen, or there's some environmental exposure. You were starved, as we were saying earlier, in childhood, and that's what put you at risk for diabetes. Or you smoked cigarettes and that's what gave you lung cancer. But a lot of people get lung cancer who didn't smoke. So, it's not the only cause, and so on.
Right.
So, So you're also right that there are external treaters or contributors towards mental disorder. And we know this from many studies. For example, the rates of schizophrenia are higher in cities than rural areas, is a canonical claim.
Right.
Um, there's something about an urban environment that's more schizophrenogenic, for example.
Hmm.
But we know that a lot of schizophrenia is genetic. So it's probably both. It's, you're at risk because you have certain genes and certain brain physiology or anatomy, probably that's a little different. The anatomy, especially, we don't really understand, but the physiology, we have increasingly some insights. And then there's an environmental trigger of some kind. Often serious abuse or trauma in childhood is a trigger for mental illness, but not the only. Many people suddenly fall mentally ill in adulthood who have no history of being
Mhm.
traumatized or abused as children. So it's a mess. It's very
Yeah.
complex. We don't really understand the brain anywhere near as well as the rest of the body, which isn't surprising given how complex the brain is. And we can speak at different levels of causation. Um, and certainly a factor is social experience. So if you put people in solitary confinement, you can make almost anyone crazy. It's extremely
Right.
rare that a person can endure prolonged solitary confinement and not lose their minds. Very few people can do that. So we know that there are external social and other forms of deprivation that can contribute. So I guess I would answer your question by saying that it's both. There's
Yeah.
an interior and one more thing, just for anyone who's struggling with mental illness or whose family members are struggling with mental illness, regardless of the cause, you are the person whose body is being affected. And ultimately,
Mhm.
only you can take responsibility for that, in my judgment. Just like if
Yeah.
you have diabetes, I can prescribe insulin to you. I can show you how to use the insulin. I can invent the insulin, but you have to inject yourself. I mean, you have to monitor your sugar and take the damn medicine.
Yeah.
And we don't have as effective treatments, unfortunately, for mental illness, but we do have some treatments for many illnesses. And here's the problem again with mental illness is that the organ that's responsible for treating the patient is the organ that's afflicted. So it's
I
you get
mean,
this other problem where people who are mentally ill often find it difficult to to do what is necessary to become well because that self same organ is the afflicted one.
right.
So anyway, I'm not telling you or any listener, I'm sure anything they don't already know, but it's you're this is too complicated. I don't think there. It's not that I don't know the answer. I don't think I think the answer is not even known to the question you
Right.
asked.
True. And even if we were to think of this not in terms of mental disorders in particular, but let's say just the common person's bad mood, and
Well, that's different.
yeah,
Bad mood.
right,
That's like having diarrhea, right? Like
yeah,
your colon functions as normal most of the time, but occasionally you have diarrhea. You got loose
right,
stools.
right,
Brain is functioning normally. Once in a while, you have a bad mood. We all
totally,
and an adult, like when you're a teenager, this is oppressive to you because you don't really understand your mind yet.
right,
But any mature individual, by their late 20s can say, I woke up in a bad mood today. It's not my colleagues at work's fault. It's not the people on the bus that I rode to work. It's not my partner's fault. I woke up with a bad mood. It will pass. Tomorrow will be
mhm,
different. And then you
yes.
just let it go.
And sometimes it's interesting that the cause of that bad mood is probably ultimately sometimes unknowable. Like in your
Yeah.
TED talk you gave, I think you gave a TED talk maybe 12 years ago where you talked about the social network and you talked about the factors that kind of explain why people cluster together in social networks, right? Like homophily or
Yeah.
confounding factors or um, the social contagion factor. Um, and you gave the example of, someone you knew, his wife died, and that was affecting you, and then you were affecting someone else, and you can kind of see this chain reaction through the network of emotional states,
Yes.
and that who's to say that your bad mood isn't related to some 6 degrees removed from a tragedy that someone experienced
Yes.
in your distant social network. I just think that that's a kind of a fascinating way to think
Well,
about our emotional lives.
yeah, we were the first to map human emotional experience in networks. To my knowledge, in 2008, we published the first social network map of happiness. So we had thousands of individuals. We knew their social connections, and we assessed using various psychometric tests how happy people were. And we found that there were clusters of happy and unhappy people within the social network. And in some ways, this is also, however, not too surprising, because most listeners will know that emotional states like fear or anxiety are contagious, or depression. I mean, you can walk into a bar, and you say, everyone's depressed here, and that makes
Yeah.
you depressed. You
Right.
walk into a party and everyone's happy here, and then you get effervescence and you get happy. Or fear is definitely, a collective experience, or can be. So, so we, so I think, in fact, I think that we evolved our emotions. I mean, why? Ask yourself why we even have emotions. I mean, it's not hard to construct an argument from evolutionary biology as to why it would enhance our Darwinian fitness to experience emotions like fear or disgust or happiness or anger. But what's interesting about our emotions is we don't just, that having the capacity for fear would be enhance my survival. That's not hard to understand. But I don't just feel fear or happiness. I also show it on my face. And I don't just show it, but you can read it. You can tell whether I'm happy or afraid or disgusted. And you don't just read it, but you copy it. So it would seem that emotional contagion is a very deep and fundamental aspect of human emotional experience. In fact, I believe that we evolved emotions as a primitive form of communication, and that this almost certainly anteceded language, and that therefore that emotions actually have a collective existence. And it's totally natural and understandable that your happiness does not just relate to your own choices and actions and physiology, but also to the choices and actions and physiology of the people around you geodesically in the network, your friends, friends, and so on. So we absolutely show that. And we've actually incidentally done many experiments since then, not just observational studies, that show that we can induce the contagion of various emotional states by experimentally manipulating. For example, I can make you happy or sad and then trace whether your friends become happy or sad according to what I do to you. So we have quite good evidence for experimental evidence for induction of emotional contagion within complex networks. So yes, I think it is the case that these emotional states are not just individualistic.
I know you're limited on time here, but maybe if you have time for one more question.
Sure, let's do another one and then
wrap it up.
Yeah.
So my question is, here we are I know you talked to Joe Rogan about artificial intelligence a little bit, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, both from the perspective of just as a professor who's trying to uphold the integrity of a college degree out here in the wake of ChatGPT and other generative AI, but also thinking in further into the future. Do you think that the advent of artificial intelligence is going to help enhance the manifestation of the social suites, or that it's going to kind of challenge our ability to manifest the social suite features?
Well, we're doing a lot of research on AI in my lab in what we call hybrid systems of humans and machines. And the quickest way I can communicate this idea is by a toy example, which is to think about a digital assistant like an Alexa. The manufacturer of that device is very interested in the human-machine interaction. In other words, whether you purchase that device and enjoy and benefit from its use depends on how that device is optimized to interact with you. For example, you would never buy a device that required you to be obsequious. Excuse me, Alexa, very sorry to interrupt you. If you don't mind, would you please tell me the weather tomorrow?
Right.
This is ridiculous. I mean, you expect to be able to say, Alexa, weather, and the machine responds. So, and that's fine until you bring that machine into your house and your children start using that machine and they learn to be rude. And then they go to the playground and they are rude to other children. So what's happened there is we've introduced a form of artificial intelligence into our midst, interacting with us as if it were a social entity. And it's changing human-human interactions. And that's what my lab has been studying, is human-human social interactions in the presence of machines, not human-machine social interactions.
Right.
And we've looked at how the introduction of diverse forms of AI, and by the way, that Alexa example is just a simple example, but for example, autonomous vehicles. which are driving on the highway. You have human-driven cars and autonomous cars. And our question is not what is the accident rate of autonomous vehicles, but what is the human-human accident rate in the presence of autonomous vehicles? Does adding
Right.
autonomous vehicles to our highway change, for example, the driving patterns of the humans near the autonomous vehicles in a fashion that affects their probability of colliding with other humans? Or you have at the CVS, you have a row of checkout clerks, and some are machines and some are humans. If you use the machine, how does that affect how the human checkout clerk? For example, does that human checkout clerk try to become more polite and more human-like to distinguish itself from the machine, him or herself from the machine? Or does that human say, I'm just like a machine, I can be an automaton, and degrade the humanity of the interaction? You see, when they're looking at the next line over, there's a machine doing its job.
Right.
So these are the kinds of things we've been studying in my lab. And I think in a sentence, what I would say is that to the extent that these forms of artificial intelligence interact with us socially, to the extent that they obey the social suite or conform to it, they could help contribute to a more pleasant and utopian future compared to if they were programmed or if they acted in a manner inconsistent with the social suite, in which case I think they could contribute to a dystopian future. And I think the
Yeah.
jury's still out, frankly, on that.
Right. Intriguing. Yeah, that's I'll stay tuned to the findings that come out of your lab because I think this is a super interesting topic. Well, we've merely scratched the surface of your expertise, but still, this has been a fascinating, stimulating
Thank
conversation.
you for having me, Nan.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm so glad that we are connected more closely on the network now. And yeah, I hope we can stay in touch. And I trust that all of the listeners who are still listening now have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So you take care. I'll let you know when we publish this episode. Thank you.